So hello everyone, we'll continue with our discussion on intellectual property rights. What we will do today is essentially to talk about the historical account of the development of intellectual property rights in the world. This is essentially to highlight the development of the domestic legal system and the institutions and why there was a need which was felt for the international collaboration for the legal protection. We will also look at how that has led to the development of international institutions essentially to support intellectual property rights across the countries. To begin with, the oldest example of grants of exclusive right dates to 14th century. During Middle Ages, as the trade and technology they developed, IP system became more elaborate and it also got linked to the political institutions. In 1474, the first patent code was issued by Venetian Senate and it also laid down the foundation for the modern patent law. Following that, the Statutes of Monopoly in 1623 was an Act of Parliament of England. It was the first statutory expression of English patent law. It in fact served as a model for the British colonies in North America, and 14 years duration was something which was being introduced as a period for the grant of patent in this particular statute. Essentially, the focus was that this is double the time which is required by a master to train an apprentice, and hence the term of 14 years for a patent grant. What we find is that after that the patent system in fact spread very widely over the other European nations and America during the 17th and 19th century. Very interestingly, what we find that at that point of a time also the nations were able to relate intellectual property right as a very important way to develop technology within their country. Not only that, they were also interested in using it much more strategically. For instance, in 1887 law in Switzerland initially was limited to mechanical inventions within the Swiss border to protect their watch industry. Now note that earlier there were two referendums which happened in Switzerland and the patent law was not being introduced. But later, as they realized that the mechanical inventions in the Swiss watch industry they need to be protected, they introduced the law. And at the same time, very interestingly, the chemical industry, which was lagging behind the German industry at that point of a time, was essentially learning from imitating the international technologies, and as a result they did not introduce patent protection for the chemical industry. However, there was a reaction from the German chemical industry and they in fact threatened Swiss chemical firms with retaliatory tariffs, and as a result Switzerland extended their protection to chemical processes but not to the product in 1907. This is a very interesting example to highlight that how at a nation level intellectual property rights became a very important point of sometimes a contention or a conflict or of a concern by the domestic industries. In fact, as we will move forward, we will realize that the similar concern has been raised by various developing countries later in the 20th century as well. The next point is related to international coordination of the patent system, under which various international conventions were being signed. Not only that, institutions like WIPO etc. were also being created. We will have a long discussion on why such institutions were being created. Very important aspect of the patent system is that in the 19th century there was a local anti-patent movement. And why? Because the proponents of the free trade at that point of a time relate IP as an institution for the restriction of the competition. They were McCulloch and Penrose in their work has mentioned, and I quote, the strength in 19th century Europe of the movement against privileges and monopoly and for free international trade was such that there was ideological linking of patent protectionism with tariff protectionism and patent monopoly with monopoly privileges in general. They also noted that the idea of patent protection regained in public appeal when after the crisis of 1873 protectionism won over free trade. In the 20th century, very interestingly what we find is the proponent of free trade argue for building a strong and a similar intellectual property right across the countries, and that has led to TRIPS agreement under the World Trade Organization. We will have more to say on this later as well. In fact, what we find is that this agreement was introduced as part of the multilateral trade agreement with the idea to remove uncertainty in the international trade of knowledge-sensitive goods. The shift in the focus of forces of free trade from anti-patent to pro-patent actually calls for attention, and we will look at the specific aspect which has led to so. In the 20th century, after the dual trade agreement, and also in the 21st century, what we find now is an almost a worldwide adoption of the patent system. And there has been indeed a tremendous increase in the patenting. Patenting has increased at not only the domestic level but also international patenting, whereby you find that the residents of one country and the firms of one country indeed want to protect their inventions across the countries. So one very important question with respect to this arises, that why is there this need for internationalization of intellectual property rights? Some of this material is from WIPO's website, whereby it has been noted that the need for international protection of intellectual property became evident when foreign exhibitors essentially refused to attend the International Exhibition of Inventions in Wien in 1873, because they were very afraid that their ideas will be stolen and they will be exploited commercially in other countries, and at a national level that would also mean losing the competitiveness with respect to the other countries. So as a result, what we find, 1883 marked the birth of Paris Convention, which was essentially for the protection of the industrial property, and also 1886 we find that of the Berne Convention, which was for the protection of literary and artistic work. One of the important characteristics of the Paris Convention was with respect to national treatment. So what do you mean by national treatment? It essentially means that each member must grant the same protection to nationals from other member state as it grants to its own national. So suppose there are two countries, country A and B, which are a member to this Paris Convention. Now member country A would be granting some kind of a protection to their own residents. The national treatment clause essentially would mean that the similar kind of protection would be granted to the nationals of the other country, that is country B, which is also a member state to the treaty. The essential idea in that case becomes the reciprocity. That means your own nationals will also get the similar treatment in country B. Apart from that, the Berne Convention effectively deals with the literary and artistic work. This also has a clause related to national treatment. In fact, Berne Convention also brought forward the idea of automatic protection, whereby no formal registration would be required for the copyright related materials. So the basic idea behind introducing of this Paris Convention was a fear among the nationals of the different countries of losing their own competitive edge with respect to the new technologies, inventions and the work that they have introduced to the other countries through imitation. As we entered in the 20th century, there were various developments. First of all, there was an immense increase in the international trade. In fact, what the world was experiencing was another wave of globalization, whereby the trade among the countries was increasing immensely. There was also an increase in the trade of the knowledge good, which we are essentially talking about the goods which are sensitive to intellectual property, which may contain new knowledge in them. And apart from that, there was increase in the trade of the counterfeited goods as well, that is the goods which are being copied, which has been imitated. Now the imitations were also being supported because of the advancements in the technology and also because of the increase in the international trade. As people got exposure to the newer products coming from the other markets and they do not have, which were not protected in their domestic market, it led to their imitations. Emerging markets also developed technological capabilities and were able to not only imitate but also do incremental work on the newer products which were essentially coming from various developed economies. Emerging products, they become, and they were also very attractive to copying. What we have seen during that time period was a strategic development of newly industrialized countries. These newly industrialized countries, they relied on the on IP sensitive products which were coming from the developed economies, copied them, developed their own technological capabilities based on the imitation, and later started in fact exporting the goods to the original producing countries. These kind of developments indeed interlink intellectual property rights more and more with the trade related issues. In the meanwhile, after the major conventions which were being faced, we find that an important institution was being created, which is the World Intellectual Property Right Organization. Now, this particular organization has a history related to Paris Convention and the Berne Convention, which were to protect the literary and artistic works. In 1967, what we found that there was WIPO was preceded by International Bureau to carry out the administrative work for Paris and Berne Convention. WIPO came into existence after 1967 Stockholm WIPO Convention, and in 1974, in fact, WIPO became a specialized agency of United Nations. The idea was to administer various intellectual property rights related treaties. Currently, WIPO in fact is a global forum for IP services policy, information and cooperation and have 193 member states. WIPO in fact administer various treaties like Berne, Paris, WIPO Copyright Treaty WCT, and also VPPT, that is WIPO Performance and Phonogram Treaty. It in fact provides global IP protection services. So, what exactly it does? As I said earlier, it provides a policy forum to shape a balanced international IP rules in a changing world. Clearly, with the increase in digitization, we find that there are much more challenges in terms of protection of intellectual property. It also provides services to IP across borders and to resolve disputes. Apart from that, a technical infrastructure has been created to connect the IP system and the share knowledge across the various intellectual property offices. It also supports cooperation and capacity building program to enable all the countries to use IP essentially for economic, social and cultural development. A world reference source for IP information, that is what WIPO has become over a period of a time. In fact, I would suggest that you please visit WIPO website for details on the different types of intellectual property rights. In fact, if you are interested in information related to data on patents, trademarks, etc., you will find the website extremely useful. There are very good reading materials, references, which can help you in developing your competencies in this particular topic as such. So what we have seen so far is that initially, following the Venetian Code, there were developments that led to the creation of the legislation at the domestic level for different countries. As we move forward and technological change was growing at a very fast pace, particularly during the 19th century Europe, there was also a need which was felt to find a protection in the other countries and to save your own products from the imitations from the other countries, essentially to maintain your competitive edge with respect to your competing countries in the international markets. That led to the creation of institutions like WIPO, which will now be administering various kind of conventions that has been brought into in order to take care of the international protection of the inventors. Please note, even with these developments, there is nothing like an international grant of the patents. Still, the grant of patent is territorial in the nature, whereby each inventor has to go forward and seek protection in every country. The most important thing that has been supported through these conventions is in fact the national treatment, reciprocity, and also ensuring that the foreign nationals get easy access to the domestic patent offices, and the process is much more easy and facilitative for them. Now we move forward and talk about a very important agreement, which is Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Agreement. This was an outcome of an immense talk during the Uruguay round of the Journal Agreement on Trade and Tariff. In fact, GATT has led to the creation of an organization called World Trade Organization. TRIPS agreement, in fact, is one of the agreement under the World Trade Organization, which was founded on four major agreements. That is Journal Agreement on Tariff and Trade, Journal Agreement on Trade and Services, that is GATS, Agreement on Trade-Related Investment Measures, TRIPS, and Agreement on Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights, that is TRIPS. So what does TRIPS agreement in fact talk about? TRIPS agreement talks about 7 types of intellectual property rights, that is patents, copyright, trademarks, geographical indications, trade secrets, among others. Then it also mentions about the national treatment, which we have already discussed, and most importantly, it also sets certain kind of a minimum standard of protection. What do we mean by that? Minimum standard of protection essentially means that the definition of, let us say, what do you mean by patent has been to an extent similar across the member states. What will it cover? What would be the duration? What are the exclusions provided? And if there are any other provisions. To give you an example, earlier there were some countries which did not provide protection to the product patent, particularly in pharmaceutical sector. The case in point is that of India. However, once you become a member of the TRIPS agreement, the definition becomes quite standardized for the protection of the patent. And as a result, the member states now provide patent protection in all fields of technology and to the both processes as well as to the products. Similarly, what it will be covering, what will be the duration. Earlier, certain countries provided 14 years of a coverage, but now the requirement for the patent protection is 20 years. So in the same way, whether we talk about copyrights, whether we talk about trademarks, in fact with respect to geographical indication, certain changes have been introduced in the various countries' domestic legislations. As far as the enforcement issues are concerned, they has been mentioned in the TRIPS agreement. Very important point with respect to TRIPS agreement is its Article 7, which talks about that why we need to do this and how it can influence the different countries. It mentions the protection and enforcement of intellectual property rights essentially should contribute to the promotion of technological innovation and to the transfer and dissemination of technology. The idea is a mutual advantage of producers and users of technological knowledge, and in a manner which is conducive for the social and economic welfare and also to balance of rights and obligations. Apart from that, when we are discussing this aspect, I think this will remind you of the conflict which we discussed some time back with respect to Switzerland and Germany. So what is expected now from the countries is to introduce changes in their domestic legislation so that they comply with the TRIPS requirement. Now if that has been going on and on a platform, we have not only the developed economies which were a member of the World Trade Organization, we had a developing countries, in fact India being a founding member of the World Trade Organization, and other least developed countries as well. Now these countries are expected to make changes in their domestic legislation as per the standards, which someone can always point out is as per the standard of protection of based on the technological capabilities of the developed countries. That can lead to a major confusion and conflict among the countries. In order to protect the interest of the developing and the least developing countries, the agreement provided for a transition phase whereby a certain time was being given to the developing countries and a more time was being given to least developed countries to introduce these changes in their domestic legislation. Apart from that, Article 66.2 of TRIPS agreement is indeed very important. It mentions the developed countries members shall now provide incentives to enterprises and institutions in their territories for the purpose of promoting and encouraging technology transfer to the least developed country members in order to enable them to create a sound and a viable technological base. So a kind of an obligation has now been put on the developed economies so that they can incentivize their enterprises, incentivize their institutions, and they should come forward and find ways to transfer technologies to the least developed countries. Please note that in the technology transfer, a major concern is always with respect to the absorptive capacity of the country to which it is being transferred, whether the country will be able to support, to receive it, adapt it, and will be able to absorb it. In that context, once again, the responsibility is on the institutions and enterprises to ensure that the transfer happens to the least developed countries. So these are the 7 types of intellectual property rights that are being covered. As I have already mentioned, including copyright, trademarks, patents, geographical indication, industrial design, integrated circuits, trade secrets and enforcement issues. We have not talked about trade secrets because many at times they may not be a separate law. As we said earlier, we have talked about the statutory IPRs. So this may not be covered under the different law in the countries. Now we will talk about history of Patent Act in India. The history of Patent Act in India in fact has 4 distinct phases. The first phase was before 1947, when India got independence, and in fact at that time it was largely driven by British policy, and thus is many times being also referred to as a colonial phase. After independence, in alignment with the overall economic mood of the country, the patent was in fact policy was being designed and changes were being introduced in a manner so that the economic and social welfare of the country was at a forefront. The next phase was during 1995 to 2005. This was to comply with the TRIPS related requirement. As I mentioned earlier, that the developing countries were required to make changes in their domestic legislation to comply with the agreement. The last phase, as we experience now, is the one during which all the changes has been introduced. However, in the recent times, there has been immense focus on improving the efficiency and working of the patent offices. So if you look at these phases, in fact, Rachel in one of his work has pointed out that these phases are in fact also reflect the journey of India, which is of a colonization, post-independence, and after globalization. So to begin with, let's look at the colonial phase. India, considering its colonial past, provided for Act 6 of 1856 based on British Patent Law of 1852 to protect the invention and ensure disclosure. This act was in fact legislated before the Sepoy Mutiny, which has Sepoy Mutiny in fact at that point of a time has prompted the British Parliament to transfer the power of Indian government, territories and revenue from East India Company to British Crown. Since it has happened before that it was repealed, and later in the same decade Act 15 of 1859 was introduced to provide exclusive privileges like making, selling, using of inventions of new manufacture for a period of 14 years to the inventors. Further, design protection was added in 1872, and also the act an authority called Controller General of Patent was being appointed. So this was the phase during the colonial, which is being referred to as the colonial phase. In fact, in 1911, the Indian Patent and Design Act was being introduced, which is very important phase. Why? Because it replaced all the previous acts and brought patent administration under the management of Controller of Patents for the first time. Further amendments were made in 1920, 1930 and 1945. All these was to either increase the scope and duration of the protection along with the administrative ease of patenting. In terms of patenting activity, a report by Justice Chand in fact note that 10,692 patents were in fact in force in 1949. The report also highlights that during 1856 to 1949, under the different acts, almost 2,99,022 applications were being filed. A very important aspect of the applications which were filed during time was that most applications originated from UK, followed by US and Switzerland. In fact, only 21% of them originated from India, and merely 15% of the total applications were filed by Indians. That reflect the patenting activity by the non-residents in India for a long time. In fact, Sagar in his work has pointed out that the interest of the British patentee was essentially to introduce the patent system so that they can actually take patent on their own inventions. The idea was to collect royalty for their own invention which could be patented in India. In view of the economic and social realities of the country, particularly after independence, and with a substantial change in the political mood of the country, there was a need which was being felt to look at our patent system. Accordingly, the Government of India constituted a committee under the chairmanship of Justice Dr. B.T. Chand. He was a retired General of Lahore High Court in 1949 to review the patent law. The idea was again to ensure that the patent law is being introduced in the interest of the country. Based on the recommendation of the committee, a bill was introduced in Parliament in 1953. However, the government did not press for the consideration of the bill and it was allowed to lapse. Another report was being given by Justice N. Rajagopal Iyengar Committee, which was constituted in 1957 by Government of India to examine the question of revision of patent law. Very interestingly, the committee recommended the retention of the patent system, even despite its shortcoming. Why? Because committee identified that it is something which is a universally adopted system. So in order to be in alignment with the international code with respect to intellectual property, they suggested that we should continue with the patent system. Interestingly, the committee also looked at that from an underdeveloped country point of view, what are the specific requirements, whether we will be able to use such a patent system or not. And I quote from the report, which mentions that with the increasing emphasis on technical education and the number of quality of research institutions that has been established in the country, together with the rapid industrialization that is proceeding, one may look forward to a time when the Indian research workers and inventor will be able to take full advantage of the patent law. Thus, the law recommended major changes also. This were in alignment with the requirement of the countries at that point of time, particularly in case of healthcare and availability of the food. The Iyengar committee cited the need to develop research capabilities in India, particularly in pharmaceutical sector. And the committee also cited the German industry case. And as a result, it suggested that the Patent Act of 1970 needs to be amended. The amendment which were introduced was first prohibited granting of patent on goods that may be used for food and medicine, decrease the duration on patent on chemical processes, and greatly increase the scope of the use of the compulsory licensing. So these were the major changes which in fact ended the phase of the product patent in India. This was a very major change in the Indian Patent Act and has been well documented in the literature with respect to the impact it has on the Indian pharmaceutical industries and the innovation landscape in the country. We will have a more discussion on it later. The another phase was with respect to the transition. The transition phase was essentially a phase which has been granted by World Trade Organization in order to support the changes in the domestic legislation to comply with the TRIPS agreement. So there were three major amendments which were being introduced. First amendment happened in 1999, another in 2002, and the last one came forth in 2005. So in the 1999 amendment, essentially at that time, the provision was created to file for applications for product patenting in the field of pharmaceutical, drug and agrochemical industries through such applications, though such applications were examined only after 31st December 2004. The amendment was essentially to provide for the grant of exclusive marketing right. In 2002, major changes were introduced with respect to the term of the protection, which was now being increased to for 20 years, and also the publication of application, which began after the 18 months, and an important provision of pre and post opposition was also being created. We have earlier talked about that. Apart from that, this amendment also required a complete description, including the source of the geographical location, particularly of the biological material, if a patent is related to such material. This is an important introduction by the Indian Patent Act. The last amendment, which was implemented in January 2005, led to the provision for the product patent in the pharmaceutical sector. The amendment also created provision for a compulsory licensing for producing and exporting pharmaceutical products to any country having insufficient or no manufacturing capabilities. This was in fact to accommodate the Doha round mandate, which has come in wake of the major crisis, health crisis that was being witnessed by South Africa due to the high prices of the AIDS related drugs. The amendment made to the Patent Act, essentially, if you look at it, was very fiercely debated in our parliament. The parliament, the members also highlighted that there is a possibility that India will once again become slave to the technologies of the other countries, and the other country will be merely used as a big market by the other country. So, after immense debate, the amendment was being passed, and the Indian Patent Act, as amended as per the requirement of the TRIPS agreement, is now active in the country. So what has that led to? In fact, it has led to the creation of a TRIPS compliant patent regime in the country. As per the Ginerte and Park Index, which captures the changes in the Patent Act and how strong it is with respect to the other countries, one can find that the strength of the patent rights in fact increased from 1.03 to 1.23 from 1985 to 1995. In fact, it later increased to 3.76 because of the various amendments which were being introduced to comply with the TRIPS agreement. So now what we have in the country is a phase whereby our IP regime is TRIPS compliant, and the focus of the recent government has been to introduce the ease of patenting. Various changes has been introduced in terms of the processing that is being done of the application and to support the startup ecosystem also. I had talked to you about earlier as well of how expedited examination has been introduced for startups, small entities and from government institutions, so that the grant period that is there between the date of the application and the date of the final grant can be further reduced. Now, when we look at this historical account of the patent policy changes that has been made in India, a very important question arises that with how well these changes has supported the innovation ecosystem of the country. One important case in point is of course the introduction of the product patent for the pharmaceutical sector. Empirical studies have used this particular change and tried to understand whether the introduction of the product patent away from along with the process patent in 2005 has actually made the Indian pharmaceutical industry more innovative. Now, the research in this case shows, if you look at the recent data, that Indian pharmaceutical sector is indeed a prominent player internationally because it supplies over 50% of the global demand for various vaccines and also 40% of the generic goods demand for the US. Indian pharmaceutical firms, they are active in production of formulations and bulk drugs, etc. Prior to the Patent Act 1970, Indian pharmaceutical industry was in fact dominated by various foreign firms that in fact controlled more than 75% of the market by importing the drugs. After the removal of product patent for the pharmaceutical sector, the country in fact witnessed the exit of the pharmaceutical countries, which in fact created the space for the domestic companies so that they can now produce and sell in the domestic market. That led to the development of technological capabilities of the domestic industry. This has been well documented in the work of Chaudhary, Kale Little and also Duggan et al. They explain in fact in their work that Patent Act 70 encouraged the entry of the domestic firms and in fact led to the reduction of the prices of medicine in the country. The Act improved the capabilities of the domestic firms and which is now being conducted more in adaptive R&D. The recent policy changes had once again brought into fore the important question of the level of the R&D expenditure which is being conducted by the pharmaceutical companies. Study has noted that industry has in fact become more research oriented, and as a ratio of the R&D to sale has in fact increased from 2% in 1996-97 to 6% in 2008 and 9. In one of our own research, we have found that based on a data of 596 countries from CMI Provis and calculating that R&D intensity is the ratio of the research and development expenditure to the sales of that particular company. R&D intensity for these firms, that 596 sample that we took, is increased from now 1.49% in 1995 to 4.61% in 2005 and later 6.62% in 2017. In fact, if you look at the R&D intensity of the top 5 R&D intensive firms, then in the particular sector, we find that it is in fact now 12.3%, which is slowly inching towards the international average. So this is an important discussion which highlights not only how the Patent Act in India has changed over a period of a time. In fact, it also highlights the role such a patent law plays in developing the technological capabilities in a developing economy like India post-independence, and also how during the globalization phase changes has been made so that we are complying with international requirement that has created the space for the intellectual property protection for the other companies that are based abroad. In fact, that has led to the introduction of the more variety of the products within the country because the foreign companies which can now protect their inventions in the domestic territory of India can in fact also introduce these products in the market without the fear of theirs being getting imitated by the domestic firms. If we look at now the patent applications which has been filed in India, this table has been created by us taking data from INPAS, which is a patent search service of Indian Patent Office. So we have taken data from 1947, and which shows that there has been a slow growth till 2003. After that, there has been a very immense growth, particularly after 2013. However, we have discussed different phases, right? Like the colonial phase, the restrictive phase, and also the permissive phase. So let us see what has been going on during the specific time phases. So this particular graph shows the patent applications from 1947 to 1994. As you can see that from 1947 onwards till almost 1962, the patent applications were inching, and they were growing at a very steady pace. After that, we find that there has been a slowdown in the process of patent application, particularly till 1985. Essentially, what we find is that it is also the phase when we have what we called as a regulated phase, and the product patent in the pharmaceutical sector was now being removed. As a result, more and more process innovations were being done in the country, and they were protected. If we look at the phase in the transition till what we have today, that is from 1995 onwards till to 2021, thereby you find that a very steady pace from 1995 to 2004. After that, there is a sudden spurt. This was also a time period when the applications made under EMR were being opened, and as a result of that backlog, what we find is a sudden spurt. Then there is a sudden dip in 2009. What this has also been attributed to the difficulties that were being faced by the Indian Patent Office in terms of dealing with the huge inflow of the application. And over a period of a time, there has been steady improvement in the working conditions of the intellectual property right, as has been mentioned by the annual report of Indian Patent Office. What we find is that apart from that, I think the intellectual property regime which has been created after 2005 has provided a space for more innovation, and in alignment with all other changes which we are experiencing in the country, there has been a steady increase in the patent application from 2013 onwards. However, there is something very specific about who patents in India. If you look at the applications, majority of the applications come from the non-resident. If you remember, when we talked about the patent, we talked about that a different type of application, like ordinary application, convention application. And if you look at these numbers, you find that, so this is the number which comes from the resident patenting, and this is from the non-resident patenting. These are the ordinary applications, and this is the applications through the convention. In fact, if you look at this number, this is essentially the national phase application under the Patent Cooperation Treaty. We talked about the Patent Cooperation Treaty and also how it facilitates the grant of the patent in the different countries. So, under the PCT, when a particular application enters a national phase, that means after getting certain stages cleared at the WIPO level, now the application has come to the national office. So those kind of an application essentially are not coming from the resident, essentially from the non-resident. So what we find is that there has been a major change in the way the things has been going over the last decade. But first, let us say if you look at 11-12, clearly non-resident applications are much more. The number for the non-resident patenting has been rather steady. But a very important change has happened, that is the increase in the number of the resident patenting. So whereas we have 8921 in 2011-12, now we have 24326. So the number is clearly increasing for the resident patenting as well. If you recall, when we talked about the colonial phase, at that time also it was being pointed out that majority of the patents are being filed by the non-resident. So that same trend seems to be continuing for a rather long time. And however, in the last quarter of 21-22, we have seen that a certain change whereby the resident applications have exceeded the non-resident one. How it will pan out into the annual data, that we will have to see. So historically, non-resident patents has been high in India. Non-resident application is still a large proportion of the applications filed, as we have shown in the figure before. That was the point I was mentioning earlier, that the domestic patent filing in fact surpassed during the quarter 4 of 21-22 and the last 11 years. So However, having said that, most of the applications are coming from non-resident, there is another important aspect that if you look at the patents which has been filed by the resident and the top patentee, in that case you will find that most of them are actually coming from the foreign firms, including Microsoft, Qualcomm, Huawei, Samsung, etc.